In this video, I'm going to be walking you through an example from my own research career about how I developed a precise, narrow research question from a broad topic of interest. And so the example comes from an experience I had 5 or so years ago. My best friend Leah from graduate school, who's now on the faculty of Yale, and I had never worked on a paper together before. And we'd sort of, at that point, been friends for 15 years or so, kind of all through grad school and through our beginning parts of our academic careers. And we decided, hey, it's time to work on something on something together. So we were kind of thinking about changes in the US labor market and in the kinds of jobs that people have in a really broad sense. And we came across a paper by a professor at MIT named Doron Acemoglu, now a Nobel laureate, who wrote about the use of robots in American manufacturing industries, which is a kind of technology that expanded during the 1980s and 2000s and kind of has the effect, as you might imagine, of displacing workers from doing manufacturing jobs. So if you can have a robot arm that moves things around in the factory, then you need less people to do that sort of thing. And so people have been interested in that because of the kind of question about whether that is kind of contributing to the decline of manufacturing industries in the US as a source of employment. So we had this one interesting paper, and we thought, let's kind of do something along those lines. And so we, kind of having worked in this area separately before, knew that there was little work done on automation technologies like robots. So technologies that displace people with machines. That's what we mean by automation. Between the development of the assembly line in the 1920s and the diffusion of robots. But that sort of leaves out really a big period of the decline of American manufacturing. So the whole kind of phenomena of the Rust Belt, for example, happens in between assembly lines and robots. So we thought, oh, that's interesting. And so our initial direction became let's find out what was going on with automation technologies between 1930 and the 1990s. What are those technologies? And kind of ask this question about how did firms sort of respond and workers respond to the availability of these new technologies. And so to kind of proceed, the first thing we did was to kind of get a lay of the land of work that had already been done that was related in a kind of general way to sort of automation between assembly line and robots and U.S. manufacturing. So kind of what is the overall lay of the land for the topic, or sort of for the paper? And so we thought we need to investigate this sort of broader topic of how automation has, in general, changed U.S. manufacturing. And so it turns out that there are people who have written about this topic in a variety of different ways. There are a number of technologies that evolved over time that were part of the automation of production. And between assembly lines and robots, there's the development of computerized tools for working with metal. And so these are sort of like the key kind of machines that are used in like making physical objects. You can think of those as machine tools. And during the 1970s and 80s, they got computerized. Um, and so we learned about all of these different technologies and how, kind of in a general sense, what was it like when they, with, employment in firms, when they diffused throughout the economy. So we learned something about that. We also learned, and some people worked on the effects of this kind of technical change on the things that firms do. So things like their investment levels, the kinds of technologies they develop and patent, how they work with one another in supply chains, how the size and scope of firms are affected by sort of changes in technology or the market. We also sort of looked at work on the effects of technological change on workers, like how much education they get, what kind of jobs do they get depending on the education that they have, what happens to wages and joining of unions and so forth. So there were a bunch of work that we looked at on those kinds of topics and kind of brought together. We also learned a bit about government involvement in the development of technology, which ends up being important in our particular topic. Um, and we also looked at work that sort of considered both um, effects at the national level, so what happens to manufacturing and workers at the level of the whole country, but also within localities. So in areas where the many different cities in the United States. So at the level of the city, say, how were cities affected by the diffusion of technological change? Um, and so we needed to kind of develop this broad set of understanding of work that's sort of generally related to this idea of automation and technical change in the economy, its effects on firms and workers, so that we could sort of figure out how are we going to narrow down the precise question that we want to ask. Understanding something about this broad landscape gave us a sense of what kind of data is available and what kinds of econometrics are people using in doing studies in this area. And so after looking at those papers that we found, we developed a sufficiently narrow research question. So we asked, how did the diffusion of computerized machine tools affect employment in US manufacturing between 1970 and 2009? And that's a question that can be answered using a regression of information at the level of counties with sort of two kinds of variables: an X variable that measures how affected was that location by machine tools, and a Y variable, such as how many people are working in manufacturing in a particular county. When there's more computerization of machine tools in that place, does the employment in manufacturing go up or down? So this question that I'm asking here is actually describing, in some sense, a regression. So this is sort of suggesting that we're going to be looking for a causal relationship. How did the diffusion of computerized machine tools, this is a measure of how important computerized machine tools were in a particular place, how did that affect employment in that place? 1970 to 2009, that's talking about the years for which we can measure everything that we are interested in, our X and Y variables. And so going from a kind of general idea to something that is a very precise question that's related to data sets and econometrics, which is where you want to go, kind of starts with a fuzzy question. You know, what did automation do between the 1920s and the 2000s in America to workers and firms? Kind of a vague question. Then looking at kind of like in this general world of similar questions, what did people find out? What information did they use to find that out? What econometric techniques did they use? Let's look at kind of the related stuff. And then that allows us to ask this very precise question that can be answered with data sets that we either know how to make or that we can source from the internet. So I hope that example is helpful to you in going through this process yourself.